wild boar were imported into Canada in the 1980s to diversify agriculture and bring in this new hot commodity that was going to stock farms for meat production primarily, but also to create these quote unquote hunt farms where you go in a penned area and can shoot a one inside. So these wild boar were brought over from the UK and raised on farms through the 80s and 90s, and that worked well for the most part up until about 2001 when it peaked, and really the market just never took off for wild boar, and there wasn't a big international market, and there wasn't even that great of a local market. And by about 2001 you could barely give these things away, and so people started cutting their fence and just letting them.
Welcome to the Swine Canada podcast. I am Dan Columbus, and I'll be your host for today's episode. And with me today, I have Dr. Ryan Brook, who is a professor in the Department of Animal and Poultry Science at the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been trying to get you on for a while, so I'm glad to see you on because I think we need to get the wild pig guy.
Absolutely.
About this, and so that will be the topic for today. But before we get going, just in case there are people out there who don't know who you are or what you do, maybe just give a little brief introduction of yourself and kind of where you've been so far.
Sure, I'm a farm boy, born and raised in southeastern Manitoba, just not too far outside of Winnipeg, and grew up on a farm, but was really interested in wildlife and being outdoors. And so I've sort of balanced those two over the years and been looking at primarily working at the interface between wildlife and livestock and how that usually can end up badly with respect to disease and crop damage and fence damage and all sorts of things where wildlife get into trouble, and we might like to see them around farms, but we don't necessarily like to see them on farms, especially in proximity to our farm animals. So that's been a big focus of our work, looking at the ecology of it and the disease ecology, but also just the practical side of how do we implement things that can hopefully prevent this. And prevention is always the best tool rather than trying to fix things after the fact.
Yeah, so like I said, a lot of big focus for yours has been on the wild pigs and that's been huge in the news lately. I know you've been given a number of talks or interviews about it, here all the way down in Texas and kind of all over. So maybe we'll just start, how did these invasive wild pigs even end up in Canada in the first place?
Right. So there are no native pigs in Canada, of course. And so these were introduced. And so there was a big push in the 1980s and through into the 90s to diversify agriculture. I remember it well. And there was saying that we're now entering a global economy and we needed to move beyond just raising, domestic pigs and cows and wheat and barley into new things to survive over the long term. And diversification was the word of the day. And during that time, there was a push. We brought in llamas, alpacas, ranched elk, you name it, were ranched as food and for creating hunting opportunities. Wild boar were imported into Canada in the 1980s to diversify agriculture and bring in this new hot commodity that was going to stock farms for meat production primarily, but also to create these quote unquote hunt farms where you go in a penned area and can shoot a one inside. So these wild boar were brought over from the UK and raised on farms through the 80s and 90s, and that worked well for the most part up until about 2001 when it peaked, and really the market just never took off for wild boar, and there wasn't a big international market, and there wasn't even that great of a local market. And by about 2001 you could barely give these things away, and so people started cutting their fence and just letting them go. And there were also leakage through that whole time as well, so animals were getting out on these farms, and again these are spread all over Canada, even in the eastern Atlantic Canada and all the way halfway up Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, well up north as well. And so widespread releases and escapes occurred over probably 3 decades at least, and to some degree still occurs. And so these things, people said, well, come on, they're not going to survive a Saskatchewan freezing winter. Does anybody know it gets to 40 below here in the prairies? This is where Ford comes to test their F-150s to see if they can hack it. The new ones can hack the extreme cold, right? So that was the assumption. But of course, these things originate from Siberia. They're large bodied, and being big is really important for surviving in the cold. Bigger you are, the better you will do under cold environments. You have less surface area to volume ratio, so you'll stay better. And of course, the wild boar came already with installed fur, and so they have really thick, heavy fur that keeps them warm. So these things are, active around through 12 months of the year, and they reproduce really, really quickly. They have 2 litters per year on average, or possibly a little bit more, and 6 young per litter on average, and they just exploded. They've spread really, really fast. They've survived the cold very well. They have few, if any, real predators, and so they've just done what invasive wild pigs have done everywhere else on the planet except Antarctica. That's the only place you won't find them in the world now, and they've done what they do everywhere: is they reproduce quickly, they eat almost anything, and they spread and spread and spread. They're really fast, and we sort of have always said they either move 8 miles an hour on the hoof or 80 miles an hour in the back of a pickup truck, and so those are sort of the 2 ways they've spread, and they've covered huge areas of Canada and continue to spread out of control on the Canadian prairies right now.
Yeah. So they're out there, they're doing their thing. I guess the question then is, how serious is this threat, and specifically even to the domestic pig industry?
I think it's certainly been a risk that I've been raising now for 15 full years and counting, and saying that there are a lot of reasons we should be concerned about it. And certainly they have environmental impacts, and then species at risk, and huntable wildlife, and water quality, and the list goes on and on. But I would certainly argue the biggest concern and risk that I have is with respect to potential disease transmission to domestic swine. And of course, there's a long shopping list of things we should think about, like Ph.D. and PRRS, and trichinella was found in a wild boar running around free in Alberta last year. And so there's a whole bunch of parasites and diseases, but certainly FMD comes to mind as a big potential one. And obviously, African swine fever is at the very, very top of the list with its capacity to spread to domestic pigs and or receive it from domestic pigs. And we know from Europe and Asia that the wild boar type animals can act as a reservoir of the disease and hold it, and they can also move it across the landscape quite effectively. And so some countries in Europe have fenced entire boundaries trying to keep wild boar out, to keep African swine fever out. And so thankfully, we have not had an African swine fever outbreak in North America yet, except for down in the extreme south on the islands. As far as northern North America, we haven't had any African swine fever, and we desperately, of course, don't want it. It would be a $1 billion catastrophe if even one case in Canada. And I remember not that long ago in 2003, I was in a meeting talking about bovine tuberculosis, and everybody's phones went off, and that was the first case of mad cow disease that was found in Canada, and instantly all our borders shut. You couldn't give away or sell a piece of beef outside of Canada, period, for a long time. And so that's big economic losses, big losses for producers, and not just small, but as I say, catastrophic $1 billion impact. So that's the one that's certainly front and center on my mind.
Yeah. So I guess, then the question is, what can producers do to maybe mitigate the risks on their own farms? You mentioned building fences is one thing, but what else can we do?
Well, I teach an ANBI 375 class called Animals, Agriculture, and the Environment. And sort of the running joke, but not really a joke, is that a correct answer to any exam question in my class is fencing and education. And I'm always a big fan of both, because you don't have to sit down and explain to swine producers, or any farmers for that matter, what fences are, or how they work, or why they're a good idea. Fences are among the easiest cells out there, and they're cost effective. And so the fencing, and even double fencing to prevent, we have seen cases of animals where wild pigs have mated through the fence with domestic pigs and had nose-to-nose contact. So I'm certainly an advocate even of considering double fencing, but also education, to learn about disease, learn about wild pigs and what their potential impacts are and where they are. And mapping them has been a core focus of our research, and making those maps easily available. So you can go onto our Facebook page, Wild Pig Research Project, and you can go on there and download Google Earth images, and you can zoom in and look at where your particular farm is and see what your relative risk is in terms of where pigs are across the Canadian prairies. And so knowing where they are, but also reporting, certainly the biggest thing that people can do is if they see any, or even if they see tracks they're confident with tracks or other sign, to report that to the provincial government so they can respond. And setting up trail cameras is relatively cheap, but it's a highly effective tool to understand what kind of wildlife is coming on and where. And so having 5, 6, 7 cameras on any individual farm can really help you understand what's happening, and it's confirmation. So, neighbor's friend at Coffee Row said maybe somebody's cousin's best friend saw a pig somewhere. That's interesting, but not particularly useful. But having a trail camera that said it showed up at 11:35 p.m. on Thursday with an exact location, and it confirmed, that's a pig standing in front of camera. That is incredibly helpful for producers to understand their local risk, but also to provide that data to governments to make good decisions, and governments will come in and trap them out and remove them. And all across the Canadian prairies, all the provinces have traps, and we'll set up these big giant panel traps and try and capture entire groups in one shot.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, because one of the big things that I've read multiple times is that, shooting them or trying to kill them does not do anything, right? But so trapping is an effective way to deal with that population then when you get those reports.
Trapping is one tool in the toolbox. There's no single tool that's going to get you there, and I sort of that's my major point, I think, with respect to current activities in Western Canada on the prairies, is that everybody's gone all in on traps, and traps can be very effective. And if they're done right, they can capture entire sounder groups. So the goal is, regardless of what you're doing, is to, through trail cameras and other insights, know that, okay, we have 12 pigs coming onto this farm on a daily basis. And the goal is to get all 12. And if you get 8, you've probably wasted all your time and money, accomplished nothing. And so certainly sport hunting, not only does it not help, because you're almost never successful. It would be pretty much unheard of to find 12 and get 12 with several guys. Even experienced good hunters with guns are going to get half on their best day. And so it's inadequate to get enough. It also scares them and makes them much more nocturnal, makes them much more wary. And I've heard many, many, many times, I've heard this story 150 times easily. They say, oh yeah, we had some pigs and me and my buddy went out and shot them and we haven't seen them since. Well, yeah, that's because they moved to your neighbors and now they're camped out in the river valley in the ugliest willows that nobody will see. And no, you didn't eradicate them. You killed some and they just changed their behavior, and now you're not seeing them. They're still around and they're getting into your corn and visiting your farm, but you're just not seeing it. And so hunting is a major part of the issue. And what I've always said is that you'll know that provinces are serious about this issue when they put a ban on sport hunting. And currently it's still open season. From everywhere west of Ontario is open season. And so I would say that is an indicator that we still have a lot of work to do to get serious about this issue, because sport hunting is also a major barrier to try and do effective control. So you set up a trap for over the course of days, months, or weeks, and do all the legwork, and then somebody shows up and says, well, hey, that guy in the red truck keeps coming in there. There must be pigs. And so they go and shoot it all up, and then you're done. You're never going to catch a pig. So you tear your whole trap down and start all over again. So they're a major barrier as well. But what I've always advocated and what we've demonstrated here in Saskatchewan is using what we call a Judas pig, where you capture a wild pig, often a male, and put a GPS satellite collar on it so you can release it. You can give it a vasectomy, ideally, and so it's not going to reproduce and address that concern. But that GPS collar, it can run anywhere. It cannot hide. You can find it any time of day or night. It also has a radio beacon, so you can listen with antennas, and so you can find that. And so the idea of a Judas pig is that you go in and find that collared pig, remove everything that it's hanging around with, and these males are best because they move. Of course, they're reproducing year-round, like our deer, our elk, our moose. Those are all reproducing one time in the spring, and that's it. 1, 2, maybe 3 young for moose is big numbers. Whereas these pigs are continuously breeding year-round, and so males are moving around the landscape, visiting with a sounder group, mating with any receptive females, And then after a few days, they move on to the next group and mate with any receptive females, and just keep doing that over and over and over. And so a Judas pig can find those sounders for you, can remove them, and allow that male to keep going around over and over and over and finding more pigs. So that will find pigs better than any other technique we've used. And we've demonstrated here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba how effective you can be at finding and removing pigs with a helicopter. And that will get you into remote areas where it's difficult / impossible to get a trap set up. And you can just cover huge areas, right? We've gone from Moose Mountain in the extreme southeast corner of Saskatchewan all the way up to Melfort Tisdale area and caught pigs all along the way, all day, and just kept finding and eliminating entire sounders. So in my view, that a Judas pig and a helicopter capture program with ground traps is among the two most effective and most compatible strategies, and those two together could be effective. We haven't seen anybody adopt the helicopter or the Judas pig yet, but that's hopeful.
So maybe that'll be something. Manitoba has their Squeal on Pigs program, stuff like that, right? And maybe that's the next step in identifying where you're seeing the pigs and stuff like that, and then going in for removal.
Yeah, that would be really effective. Absolutely. U.S. has been working really hard to get approval for a nitrite-based poison. That's still in the works. The biggest challenge, of course, with poison is public acceptance. And then perhaps even more challenging is what they call bycatch. So you find some dead pigs, but you find dead crows and deer and wolves and coyotes and who knows what else. So trying to figure out ways that only pigs will eat it has been an ongoing effort. But that might come down the road yet too. I know Saskatchewan talked about poison. We haven't used it yet, to my knowledge, but that may come down the road.
So I mean, talking about this and what can producers do, it's making me think, because there is an increase in what we call the small scale pig producers or your backyard pig producers, right? And I'm not throwing them under the bus here, but I am interested, if the techniques or the risk is different depending on what we would say is our normal commercial level pig production versus the backyard producers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We of course, as you know, we have more small pig operations with a handful of animals in Canada than we do large commercial operations, and the quality and range of those varies dramatically from some that are very well run and well maintained to others that have little to no. We often call them back to the landers. They're born and raised in Toronto or Saskatoon or Winnipeg, and they want to get out on the land and they want to raise wild boar, and they maybe don't know what biosecurity is or what ASF is or other concerns are. And so I think those are big issues. A lot of these maybe don't have the quality of fencing, where certainly the overwhelming majority wouldn't have shower in, shower out, or any major biosecurity. Some of it's just, in some cases we've seen where it's pallets nailed together they got from somewhere and put a single strand of electric wire, and those animals are getting out. And in fact, we were at one in Saskatchewan where a wild boar actually hopped the fence and moved in and stayed, and the guy was very happy to have it. And he ended up mating all of the females that were in the backyard, and all of the piglets that spring had those horizontal cream-colored stripes and were covered in hair. They were wild boar domestic pig hybrids, and so that just makes me cringe all over for a whole bunch of reasons. And I stopped, and when the wild boar was in there before he mated, I sort of said, like, I have a bunch of reasons why this isn't a great idea, including optics. It does not look good to have a wild boar mixed in with domestic pigs in Saskatchewan or anywhere else for that matter. And so I offered him $200 and $300, and I got up to, I think it was $2,600. I was ready. I think I could probably have pulled out of my bank machine and pooled together to pay. And he said, no, it wouldn't sell it for any price. And because I wanted to honestly just buy it and then euthanize it and just eliminate that risk. But so yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons why that it has higher contact risk, generally speaking, with these sort of smaller scale, perhaps less closed in and less biosecure systems. And that's may well be where we see that happen. And food management is another thing, right? The commercial operations are using commercially made feed, where a lot of backyard farms are throwing table scraps. And, my grandma used to have back in the day, the slop pail, all the potato peelings and any leftovers of any kind went into the bucket and was fed to the sow. Which made sense back then in some ways, but now makes no sense good sense, and we really, really don't want to see that, especially, of course, if any of these feed came from areas with African swine fever. So lots of reasons why we need better management at that side as well, and how especially backyard producers can up their game in terms of fence quality and biosecurity and keep these things out.
Yeah, just part of the education and the efforts to make sure that things are being done correctly and safely. So you mentioned a couple of different strategies and things. Is there anything else that we should be looking at regarding this crisis?
Well, certainly the removal process. I mean, part of it is farm level security, right? And every farm. I have been an advocate for a long time, and again, unfortunately, my ideas haven't got traction yet, but I hope at some point they will. But on-farm risk assessments, we've developed these for wolves. We've also developed a tool for elk and deer with respect to bovine tuberculosis, and so we could easily produce an on-farm risk assessment tool where you could sit down with producers and say, okay, describe your operation, and each aspect gets different scores. And then you get an overall score saying, okay, this is your overall risk score with respect to feral swine or invasive pigs. And so that tool could easily be developed if there was interest in using it, and could be used to assess risk. And what we did with the bovine tuberculosis one is then also you'd go to that farm, but you take a vet, you take a feed specialist, you take, farm extension people, biologists, 4 or 5 experts in different areas, and sit down and say, well, this scores really well and you've done well here, but boy, we have some concerns about how you're feeding the animals that are, spreading feed around the ground is much more risky than putting it into feeders and things. And so there's things that can be done on each farm to improve the risk and understand. If you had, say, $100,000 to try and improve biosecurity, then you could also say, okay, here's the 20 or 30 farms that rank as our most concerning, not only by their behavior, because of course interactions with wild pigs are what farmers do and how your farm is set up, but also where you are with respect to, in the Melfort-Tisdale area is the hotspot in Canada by far. And so if you're anywhere in that area, your risk is going up a lot with respect to pigs. So on-farm risk assessment is something that, in my view, should be a no-brainer and should be done and probably repeated over time. And certainly education and spreading good details and demonstration farms to show how, what is good biosecurity looks like, I think would be really effective. And yeah, I think word of mouth is always some of your best options for sure.
No, very interesting. Well, it's been a great talk. Before we get to our last 3 questions, I'll just ask you to give a take-home message for our listeners.
Big take-home is that invasive wild pigs are out there. You may not be seeing them, but they are around, and they're spread extensively across the Canadian prairies now. They're here to stay. Any opportunity to eradicate them, which we had, is now long past. And so they're here permanently on the Canadian prairies. And so we need to learn to live with them and minimize that risk through biosecurity, but also efforts to find and eliminate as many pigs as we can. And I think that's the really critical part, is getting the pig numbers down, but also managing farms to prevent those direct and indirect contacts.
Yeah. So deal with your farm, squeal on the pigs. Hopefully we'll help the problem. So, okay, well, Ryan, before I let you go, we have our big 3 questions that we ask every guest.
It's time for our famous 3. Working with nature and not against it, piglets fed AX3 see significant and improved feed efficiency. Producers know the reality of needing to reduce antibiotic and zinc use. AX3 Digest is a highly digestible novel protein that promotes improved in-barn performance, piglet health, and minimizes the need for zinc in the diet. For more information, visit www.protecta.com. That's www.protecta.com.
Our first one is what is your favorite swine-related resource?
My favorite swan, I was going to say my own Facebook page, the Wild Pig Research Project. That's the one that I do go back to for a lot of information and lots of videos and things. I like this broadcast. I follow quite a number of people on Twitter that are really, really knowledgeable and effective as well. I don't know if I can name any off the top of my head. INET in Europe is one of my favorites. They have just released a whole bunch of information on wild pig management in Europe and how they manage risks around wild pigs. And they're about 3.5 light years ahead of me and my research program in terms of understanding this stuff.
Yeah, you can feel free to say your website again. I think that is important to get it out there.
Follow me on Twitter at Ryan K. Brook. Lots of stuff about wild pigs and a few jokes in there, or dad jokes anyway. If you assume that dad joke and joke are the same thing. And also our Canadian Wild Pig Research Project. That's us. And we're on Facebook and we post lots and lots of maps. We're in fact the only resource for maps really to speak of in Canada. There's not a lot of other options for good, detailed, up-to-date maps. So that's certainly a place to learn that, but also to ask questions and just see what's going on in terms of the research that we're doing.
Yeah, great. So next question is a favorite book or resource outside of pigs?
Well, there is a book called The Wild Pig Management in North America that just came out. I've contributed fairly substantively to that. And that book is available on Amazon, and it will tell you everything you want to know about wild pigs and their management, and looks at it from different perspectives across North America, and looks at the urban, but also we're also seeing them, of course, in rural areas, but in urban areas becoming established as well, and all the information with respect to what to do about them.
Okay, and then our last question. When you look at pork producers or leaders, if you want to go that way, what is a characteristic that the successful ones share, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that strong leadership is making some tough decisions. I think we're going to need to see people that are going to have to deal with the political hot potato of hunting wild pigs and talking about other things. Trapping has been a relatively easy sell, but it's not the only option out there, and we need more than one tool. We are not going to succeed with trapping alone. That's an absolute given. And so certainly folks that are willing to make those big, tough calls and investing money. We have to spend money on these control efforts, and that has gone up and up and up over the last about 5 years or so. We've seen major contributions towards improving control efforts. I just think we have to go from those what are frankly so far baby steps into some major commitments to really address this, because we hit the snooze button for so long and ignored it. That means we have to be that much more aggressive and spending more money now to get in front of it.
Well, Ryan, it's been great to have you on the show finally, because like I said, it's been almost 2 years and I've been trying to get you on for all that. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.